All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the September 6th, Wednesday, is still Ambient Weekly Contributors Meeting. And first on the agenda, we have Keith asking about where we are with hairpinning.
Sure. So around 3 weeks ago, we had an agenda topic where we talked about whether or not we want to hairpin, do we want to customize redirection in Ambient, and as been summarized in this issue on GitHub, the takeaway is that from that meeting is that we're not going to customize redirection in Capture for beta, maybe even ever, because the trade-offs aren't something that we're okay with, and that we need global and port level MTLS in Ambient when it comes to pure authentication policies to govern the capture. So with that in mind, I wanted to circle back around to see where we are with hairpinning in general. As you might remember, that whole discussion was kind of triggered by Stephen's doc around Z-tunnel hairpinning and how you want to handle the situation when uncaptured traffic is destined towards to a capture pod. From my recollection, it feels like the prevalent approach that there's the most consensus on was to do plain, not neutral TLS for those uncaptured source workloads. But I wanted to ask everybody to see if you want to rediscuss that. Stephen had multiple options in his doc. So by the time to go back to the drawing board and kind of find some consensus there in order to move forward with implementation. I already saw one down vote, which I believe is John. So feels like we've got some stuff to discuss.
Yeah, I didn't agree with the using plain text part. I didn't realize other people thought that either necessarily. So hopefully I'm not the only one person that's blocking us. Oh, sorry. Wait, when you say plain TLS, never mind. Sorry. I thought
single leg. Yeah, single leg TLS.
My bad. I changed my mind. Thumbs up.
That's the only option we have, I guess, is the single leg implementation hairpin. I think Costin wanted to assess the security impacts of that, and I think he's right too, because that would still require us to add basically a one-off custom flow degraded off-end just for this case. But I think we have to. So we have to just kind of take that. I think that hit. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, so just for completeness sake, there are a couple of other options in the doc that all have their various pros and cons, whether it was special Z-tunnel identity, deny always, plain text pass-through. I think plain text pass-through was the other big one that had some support for it. Just for transparency's sake, I'm also in favor of the one leg TLS for hairpinning. But if we agree, we can move forward with that, and I can sign up to take care of the implementation if we're cool with that.
Can someone elaborate on what one leg TLS means?
Sure, we actually have diagrams, thanks to Stephen. So Francis, if you could open up the Z-tunnel hairpinning doc.
One sec.
Yeah, sure. Scroll down.
Which section are we talking about?
The big yellow diagrams. Right there. Oh yeah, so essentially what's the flow is that the source pod sends a connection of some sort or request to the capture destination pod, and that capture destination pod also has a waypoint. The Z-tunnel, in order to enforce policy and such, is going to hairpin that request to the waypoint. Waypoint's going to apply policy, et cetera, and then send traffic, if allowed, back down to the Z-tunnel. And the underlying question here about hairpinning is, what identity should the Z-tunnel use to forward traffic to the waypoint? Typically in the HPhone use case, it's a delegated identity flow where the Z-tunnel uses the identity of the workload, the captured source, to send to the waypoint. And usually it's not a hairpin situation, it's the source Z-tunnel sitting to the destination waypoint. In the hairpinning scenario, there is no source identity. And so the underlying question is, do we have we have other different options for how to handle there not being an identity that we can verify from the Istio side? Do we set a special unauthenticated identity? Do we just deny all plain text to Istio? Again, it could be encrypted by some other means, but all, in the Istio context, do we just deny all plain text traffic? Do we allow plain text traffic to the waypoint? Up into this case, we up until now, to this point, we have not allowed anything plain text to go to the waypoint. We just everything had to be HPhone. And so those are the kind of the approaches to this underlying problem of how do we handle uncaptured traffic we cannot access an identity. Does that make sense, Mitch?
I think so. Thank you.
Sure. And hopefully the diagrams help illustrate the flow as well. Cool. Oh, one other thing to add with the proposed one-leg TLS approach, for more security conscious users, they will always have the opportunity to add a peer authentication and set strict MTLS policy if they want to deny all plain text traffic. And even with hairpinning, I think we discussed that as a short path that can apply at the Z-tunnel to where plain text traffic under a strict peer authentication policy won't even go to the waypoint. It'll be just the traffic will be dropped at the Z-tunnel.
Yeah, no hairpin.
Okay, yeah, so if we have agreement here, what I will do is I'll create an issue kind of summarizing the implementation and work on implementing it. Thanks, folks.
Okay. Next up is also yours.
Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah, so I should have added the link here. It's in the stream review section, but I'll copy it down for completeness. But I wanted to remind folks, especially TOC members, that there's a second doc that needs reviewing. So the target ref PR for the API changes to target ref to Istio policy when you're talking to waypoint or other or gateway API gateway, that's merged. But for authorization policy, the full kind of vision of what we want for ambient and even authorization policy, ambient specifically, there's another step that's needed for auth policy, which is to add a layer field to indicate what layer the policy is targeting. The doc has more information along with some examples. And so just a reminder to folks to take a look at that, especially TSC members looking for a couple more approvals. I think John's approved, but we need a couple more before we feel comfortable moving forward with API changes and any sort of implementation. So just a reminder.
And Keith, it's the same doc up here in the still in review section, right?
Correct. Correct.
Okay. Do you have some kind of timeline as to when you like this to be reviewed?
I think that as far as the drop ambient to beta doc timeline goes, I see this as pretty important changes, just because the API changes are going to impact a lot of the other pieces of functionality that we might need to do for ambient. So I'd love to try to get this, get the underlying API PR out soon. Maybe merge by end of September would be, I feel like a reasonable goal based on based on existing timelines for things that need TOC approval. So as soon as, again, especially TOC members, as soon as you can, we really appreciate a review.
So when we sign off by next week, is that because ASAP can mean a lot of things to different people. So sign off by next
I will say
Wednesday.
sign off by next week would be much appreciated. But yeah, let's say that.
Kit, to confirm, the plan is that the API will be merged and the implementation will, I mean, when we unhide it or whatever, it will be ambient only. And for waypoints for L7 and Z-tunnel for L4, with everything else not supported.
Yes, I think that makes
Okay.
the most sense. The only place where we're splitting up layers when it comes to any practical topology is ambient at this point. So yeah, anything targeting the sidecar would not be. I don't think would be valid.
Or gateways. So both of them will be out of. I think it's fine. That's and are you pursuing any similar authorization? I mean, or we had many discussions in the gateway group about adding some form of authorization policies. Are you or someone else pursuing that, or gateways themselves?
I'm supposed to be. I took a action out of a couple of weeks back in the Gateway API meeting to do some investigation and have been buried with other things. But it is in the scope of Gamma for sure to try to do this. And to be honest, I think it would be really interesting to have this layer targeted approach in Istio for ambient and see how that works and potentially integrate that in whatever we do upstream in Gamma. Because I think separation would be really interesting.
I'm not interested in Gamma. I'm interested in the proper gateway spec for ingress and for the not.
Interesting. Okay. As far as the proper gateway API proper in the ingress use case, I don't know if anybody's looking into operation policy for that. Yeah, I don't know if there's anybody pursuing that at the moment. Yeah.
Because I'm sure every gateway implementation has its own authorizations. There is no question that everyone who implements a gateway will have some authorization. Okay, good. Just wanted to see where we stand with different directions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the questions.
All right. If there's nothing else on that one, next up is Kevin. Where are we with SE scope?
Oh,
what is
service entry. I meant to service entry. So at Link, there's a design doc that we spoke about a couple weeks back, kind of arguing that the current behavior for scope of service entries is wrong, and it's been discussed before. I learned. So there's some context from 2019. This was discussed then, and there's other GitHub issues I dug up. My position hasn't really changed, which is that after you looking at the additional context provided, that we should change the default scoping of service entries in ambient. And I wanted to get more eyes on this. The last action item was to look over the context from 2019 and go through the old GitHub issues and link to the other stakeholders. And yeah, I think we should still just namespace scope them is the short answer. And I'd love to take this work on if we can get agreement. Someone has their hand up.
Yeah, I've read this a few times, and one thing I struggled with is understanding why we're doing this. Like, what problem are we solving that people have? Who are we solving it for? What's the requirements? Like, I'm missing a lot of context, I think.
Yeah, for me, go ahead.
No, I think, sorry, that was a stale hand.
Oh, okay. I thought I heard a voice. No, so for me, the requirements are that namespace boundaries are respected and that we're multi-tenant safe. And service entries today are not. And so that for me is the requirement. Who we're solving for, I linked a couple of GitHub issues of other people who have run into bugs related to this behavior today. This is how service entries work today in classic Istio. And I've linked a couple other users. I myself ran into this. I know that you, John, and Louis had argued that not a lot of people run into this, but I dug through some GitHub issues and found people who did. So I think that argument just isn't quite strong enough. The fact that maybe, because it is a little contrived, I'd have to go use a host name that someone else was already using and define a conflict, or just, you know, if you're going to like google.com, I have to define a service entry that is Google, which is kind of weird. But that doesn't mean I can't break someone, especially if I'm malicious. Costin?
Again, to confirm, you want to fix this for ambient, so it's a new world, not necessarily to break existing users here with old, or do you want to also fix for sidecars?
I would like to fix it for both, but I understand the feasibility of doing it for Classic is very difficult, and frankly, the timelines aren't the same. I mean, that ship has already sailed, so I think the time frame, like in my mind, doing this for Ambient needs to happen before Ambient, so that's the urgency to think about now.
That's excellent. One thing, I mean, we had some discussions internally about service entry quite a bit. You know, service entry is used for, you know, we have the deprecated part, which is duplication of workload entry for which maybe we should at some point, you know, not have two ways to do it in ambient. Then there is use for egress gateways, which I didn't even know that ambient has a solution for egress gateways right now. And then there is, you know, the setting HTTP layer, you know, properties for outbound for egress, which again, I don't think it's supported. Did we add support for it in ambient? I saw that Zitan is only doing L4. So I'm trying to see how it fits in ambient in general.
I think the idea is that service entry today is implemented in ambient, and the API that is supported, I think, is not correct. So I know that we don't support egress and all these things today. I think we will eventually, and we might be stuck with a bad decision if we don't fix it now.
But what do we support? I mean, you mean the user service entry to add IP and VM mesh expansion, or which should be using actually workload entry, or you mean to just create some DNS thing? Because in ambient, I mean, we support maybe some fields and some very, very narrow use cases, but we definitely don't support the entire thing. I mean, redirecting to the egress gateway, or you know, applying L7 anything. It's a narrow slice of service entries that we support. So that's what I'm trying to find. Which one are you talking about? Because there are 50 different ways to use it.
I think the way, I mean, we use it today for like even things that are in Kubernetes, which is perhaps abusing it. But my concern is not whether or not we're abusing it, but my concern is that it can be used maliciously.
Yeah, completely agree with you. I mean, the problem is that again, there's so many things that are in service entries that it's very difficult to know which one we are talking about. John, maybe you have a better idea.
Yeah, I was. I don't know if I'm necessarily agreeing, but like if our goal is to make it so that Istio is multi-tenant and has strong namespace boundaries, this is nowhere near enough. Like I can easily just go make a virtual service for google.com and any namespace, and that'll be used by everyone, right? So I feel like we're not really meeting the goal, if that's the goal, which is not clear because there's no goals really stated. And like the issues aren't actually, I mean, I looked through the linked issues. Most of them don't seem to actually be fixed by this either. So it's very hard to understand what we're actually trying to do. I mean, it's clear what we're trying to do. It's not clear why we're trying to do it and if it meets the requirements of what we're trying to do.
Okay, if the pushback is that we need more succinct goals, I'm happy to update the doc with more goals. My goal is namespace boundaries, right? So if virtual service is also global, I have a similar concern for that. And so I would like to include that in this doc. It's the same motivation.
John, you're done.
Yeah, no. It's not clear what a namespace boundary means either. Like someone creating a, you know, I mean, if you import anything from the other namespace, then they have the ability to mess with your workload to some extent. I could create 10,000 services as one example in DOS, the sidecar. So it's like, is there a specific isolation goal that we're trying to achieve? Because if we just say multi-tenancy, it's become meaningless because everyone kind of has different ideas of what tenant isolations actually mean.
So one way to look at it could be that in general, service or anything that is analogous to a service has been namespace scoped both in Kubernetes APIs as well as I think routes in gateway APIs are also scoped by namespace. So service entry and virtual surface are, essentially analogous to external services and routes. And it would make sense to have them be namespace scoped to prevent clashing, especially when you're within an enterprise where multiple tenants might choose, mail.xyz.com as an external URL, and they might step on each other. So it does appear to me, and again, I'm relatively new to the community, so maybe I'm missing something, but it would appear that these are all analogous to variations of services and should be namespace scoped, just like regular Kubernetes services are namespace scoped and routes are namespace scoped. 2 cents. And
you're absolutely right.
It's true that multi-tenancy is sort of ambiguous, but the part that is common is that it is always a variation of namespace-based isolation. So I think we can reasonably assume that if anybody does a multi-tenant solution, they will include an element of separation by namespace. 2 tenants will never share the same namespace, for example. So
Sure, I totally get that namespace isolation is important. I just don't think that this actually gets us meaningfully more in that direction. Like, we already have boundaries that can be enforced. For example, we have imports and exports. So why, when we can already put imports and exports both at global and per pod or per service levels, and I mean that for both of those, both imports and exports. So we have like 4 different levels of controls. Why do we need more levels? Like, why can't I just not import the other namespaces if I don't want to use them, or enforce at the cluster level that I don't want to export?
now, what if a malicious user imports from another and clobbers that destination?
Well, I mean, we have to be able to import. So even in the proposal, you can import someone. If you import them and they do something you don't like, then that's kind of your fault. Like, you should not have imported, right?
I mean, maybe that further suggests that there should be some policy filters to control what you can export and import. I mean, that could be yet another feature.
It could be, but we don't have any real demand or use cases or requirements. So it's all kind of made up complexity at this point, it feels like. I mean, at least that have been presented. Maybe there is, but we can always add more and more options in complexity. But unless we have real demand and there's use cases that aren't being met by it that users actually have,
So here's the thing, though. You're right that maybe, firstly, not too many people use multi-tenant, service mesh, especially with Ambient, obviously. So there won't be that much demand. So at least, but the longer you go without changing it, the harder it gets to change eventually. And if we think architecturally it's the right thing to do, then sooner is better than later. If we take the analogy of Kubernetes services and gateway API routes, they did, have similar rationale for making it namespace scoped.
And maybe that's the answer. I mean, for example, virtual service, you mentioned virtual service is a similar problem. Well, for virtual service, we have a solution which is HTTP route, which it's clearly defined, has a very clear semantics about namespace boundary. It's not really about multi-tenant in general. Probably we should stop mixing multi-tenant. It's just normal behavior in Kubernetes that everyone should follow. And for service entry, the reason I asked about which part of service entry we are talking about is because the right solution for Ambient is to define something similar to the HTTP route and disambiguate.
But wouldn't it be further confusing where HTTP route is namespace scoped and virtual service is not namespace scoped? Are they essentially not the same thing?
No, I mean, the HTTP route is fixing the misbehavior of virtual service with regard to namespace from my perspective. And they're different because they behave differently. And
Yeah, not exactly the same thing, but they seem functionally similar, perhaps. I mean,
yes,
any
I think
reason,
that
any reason
it-
for service and routes to be namespace scoped would be the same reasons for service entry and virtual service to be namespace scoped.
so my point was that we fix virtual service by creating HTTP route. I mean, you cannot, it's very tricky for users to have one CRD called something that behaves in 5 different ways and does, depending on context. If you're using it ambient, it's one way. If you use it in sidecar, a different way. Nobody can keep track of this. So maybe take with a part of service entries that you absolutely need. I mean, is it egress? I don't know which use case you really have in mind. And create a new CRD. It's not that hard to create a new CRD and have proper semantics and narrow. And maybe, in the context of gateways so other people can adopt, it's not issue specific and so on.
I think it's just for architectural consistency, perhaps. I mean, you're right. I mean, you can just create a new CRD which has a different scope than what you think the current one has. At least my perspective is that service entry is essentially an external service, and the same kinds of logic should apply as for any service. Similarly with virtual service. So that's the view. But you're right, there is a big issue that, hey, the sidecar mode has already been shipping with this scope, and that is definitely a concern. But the longer we don't do this, then the more likely it just never happens. Yeah. So
Mitch, I think you're up next.
I just want to make sure I understand the problem that we're discussing here so that I'm on the same page. If today you want to add a service entry or frankly a virtual service, and you want to make sure that it does not disrupt existing traffic in your mesh, what you need to do is to look at every other namespace to see if there are other service entries or virtual services defined with that same host. And then look at the actual telemetry data from all of the traffic to see if someone is accessing that host without a service entry. And then you can know, okay, this host name is or isn't safe to use. Is that a correct summary?
well, firstly, you may not have visibility into what other namespaces.
Sure, there are tons of problems with that workflow. I just want to make sure that that is, in fact, the workflow.
Yeah, that's my summary.
John, is that your understanding as well?
I don't know that you can really get the telemetry without the service entry, so it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. But yeah, I mean, in general, that's how you could do it.
Okay. And John, I think does that seem problematic to you?
Oh yeah, it's definitely problematic. I'm not arguing that it's not problematic. I just don't think that making service entry scope namespace solves really any of the problems.
Okay, so if we were to either include virtual service in the scope of this or to say virtual services don't apply in ambient, that would make it more globally useful.
It's not necessarily just that. Like, I think the whole service entry API is kind of broken to some extent. Like, we can't even implement half the API in ambient, and then now we're saying it behaves differently. Like, it's kind of getting wonky. So I don't necessarily know. I don't think the solution would be just include virtual service. I'm not necessarily sure what the solution would be.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Keith.
You're up. Are you sure?
No, when I'm in the room, the hand doesn't automatically go down. So go ahead.
Okay, gotcha. So ideologically, I'm on the side of things for the namespace should operate in namespace scope. I do hear the feedback though, and I think it's compelling. What it sounds like we need. Let me phrase that differently. It sounds like what we need is a new resource. It sounds like service entry is broken. there is a subset of function. There's a good bit of functionality in the API that's not usable in Ambient, which we're wanting to, have stable support for at some point in the future. Have interop between Ambient and Sidecar SEO at some point in the future. And it's very difficult to have any kind of, I don't even say parity, it's difficult to have any kind of interop when you've got two different behaviors in a way that is pretty intrusive to users making networking calls. So what it sounds like, I can't remember who said it in the past, but I wonder if, similar to the Kubernetes service resource, if service entry isn't doing too many jobs, or if it is doing too many jobs, and the project could benefit from having different resources, smaller resources, or just different resources to accomplish those things that are keeping Ambient in mind. And that's how we move forward here. It's a little crazy. It's a delta of work for sure, but what is our appetite for something like that?
I would go back to the point that, firstly, the analogy with Kubernetes services, and secondly, was there a strong reason for this to have global scope to begin with? We don't know the history of past discussions on this, but was there ever a strong reason for this to specifically have global cluster scope? Resources probably should prefer smaller scope than larger, and the analogy with services suggests that it should be namespace scoped. But of course, we're dealing with the fact that Sidecar already has this shipping with global scope, and that makes the transition harder.
Just to be clear, service is not namespace scoped. It's globally scoped. It's just that there's a unique host name for each service, which is not a property that we can have in service entry. But the proposal here is to mean that a service entry is only bound to the namespace, which is not at all how service works. You can reach any service in the cluster.
No, the service API resource is namespace scoped.
So is the service entry resource.
Okay.
Yeah. The problem is that it impacts other namespaces, which is the same as service.
Okay. So maybe we need to think about
the impact there is categorically different though, right? Like when you create a namespaced service, that URL has a namespace as part of its identity. So there's very little chance of someone accidentally already having been using that and now it changes. Whereas if you're capturing google.com, there's actually a pretty decent chance that other namespaces are already using that and get effectively a surprise when a service entry changes the definition without having access to their namespace.
I mean, at the end of the day, it feels like the core problem space is that we are attempting to create, namespace is so overblown, but like tenancy or namespace properties within a global registry, which is DNS, right? That's the common thread between the service resource, the service entry resource, is that you are effectively capturing, via, I won't say capturing, but the routing is happening and the resolution is happening via DNS. The way that service gets around this is, it makes the global thing have the namespace embedded in it to reduce collisions. But to John's point in the chat, if you have a COM namespace and you create a Google service within the COM namespace, you will run into some unexpected issues because at the end of the day, DNS is still going to be global and it's difficult to, have that intent of how that's supposed to work in any meaningful way. So we tell folks to avoid making your namespaces, conflict with external things. So it does feel like the current behavior, because I can't remember who said it before, but because service entry is inherently global because you're specifying the full host, like we're not appending the service entry namespace. Like we don't have any kind of key to represent the namespace or to push to the network layer the namespace of the API object the way the service does. It feels like there is a potential for improvement in the API, either improvement or replacement in the API to account for this and to better match some of the implementation details in service that make it workable.
But I'm still curious what exactly use case you have in mind. I mean, is it for egress, proper egress, Kevin, or is it for something else? Because I still fail to see how the egress is used. You define google.com. How does google.com in service entry get processed by Ambient? You give it an IP address and then zTunnel is routing to something, or sorry, I'm lost in.
Yeah, the original, the google.com example I tested with Classic and Sidecar. I noticed that behavior and noticed we were copying it to Ambient, and that felt wrong. So I don't have an Ambient use case, but to Sanjeev's initial point, I think this is the time to, our choices are remove it before beta and kick the can, or we should fix it now. But I don't want to ship service entry with something that is perhaps a foot gun.
I mean, it would be a foot gun if it worked, but I still cannot see how google.com would be implemented in Ambient, since, again, zTunnel does implement HTTP processing. So it wouldn't know it's google.com.
We had the whole XDS Ambient evolution, right? And so you get workloads that can be a host name, which would be resolved on demand DNS, or you could just go to that DNS, and zTunnel, if it looks up and has that host, it might go to the wrong place. So just in theory, it feels like that we could have that problem again, which makes sense because we have it in Classic. I haven't tested it in Ambient. I don't know if that is truly a problem in Ambient, but I think the whole point is API architectural. It's not how does Ambient work today. I think that answer to that question should be for like going forward before we ship beta, make sure we're happy about the state of things. That's the question I want to make sure that's answered. Right? If we think service entry is a bad API and we're not going to support an Ambient and we're going to do something different and better, then sure, let's do that and not ship beta with service entry. But I want to make sure that we don't ship something bad. That's all.
Oh, I completely agree.
That's a plus one for me too. I think it sounds like we're circling around.
But I also want to call out that I feel this way about virtual service too, though. So I want to, maybe the action item here is to come up with more examples for virtual service, because we're also in that same place.
We are not. Virtual service has a replacement. It's called HTTP route and has proper namespace. And let's not invent another HTTP route. That's I think.
Okay, I have to look at it more. I believe I haven't tested that or thought about it myself, but if you off the cuff think it's resolved, it probably is.
The initial API proposal for Ambient actually had no virtual service. It was kept in mostly by desire from Solo, actually. So if that desire's changed, then we could potentially reconsider that as well.
Well, I can see a point to keep it for a while for migration or whatever, but my point was that we should not try to replace it with yet another one. We have HTTP route as replacement. It's fixed.
I can't speak for all of Solo. I'm gonna have to talk internally before I can get back on that. But if virtual service has the same problem, I have the same personal opinion. So I would like to take that up with them.
It doesn't have the same problem with Ambient waypoints because the waypoints kind of change the model. So it's all It does in sidecars, but removing it from ambient wouldn't help sidecars. So I guess it probably doesn't really help in this case. Like a waypoint only. A random namespace can't define a virtual service for a different namespace and then have that waypoint actuated. That would be terrible and not how it's implemented. So.
So is our action item here for Kevin to explore and implement, or like how root works, how egress works in ambient today to understand whether we have a problem or not, or is there other action we need to discuss?
I think I
Yeah,
heard
I think-
two actions. Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
I only remember one, so can you list them both?
Maybe I got confused, but it sounds like there was some agreement on service entry, but questions open on virtual service. I might have heard that wrong, though. Interpreted that wrong.
Yeah, so frankly, I haven't spent enough time thinking about virtual service, so I don't feel I can speak to that. But I do agree with the sentiment that the idea is if we're looking at multi-tenancy and namespacing, we should do this across the entire Istio API for ambient before it goes in. So I agree that the design doc should take into account anything virtual service related and whatnot, if like it should be holistic. So I think it's on me to explore and understand that and perhaps include that in the doc and any other APIs that may be globally scoped. I see John had a question in the chat. If we drop service entry, does that point to dropping DNS as well? It probably would. It's the only thing that it's used for, right? I think we need other folks to weigh in there.
I'm a +1.
Oh.
Go ahead, Carson.
As a reminder, the reason we have DNS capture in Istio, the original reason, was for security, because application needs to resolve a service name, a fully qualified domain name. And if the underlying network is not secure, so if the DNS resolver is not secure, then our security is broken, because someone man in the middle the DNS, and then we capture a different thing, we verify wrong certificate and so forth. There is a document describing it. That is and remains a valid use case. I mean, if you have a network where the DNS resolver is not secured, we need some form of DNS capture, or you need to put some secure DNS in place. Doesn't matter which one. And that's the only thing. I mean, later we abused it to implement service entry other things, but the fundamental reason is still there, because our security model is based on intercepting IPs that are result of DNS resolution.
So if our answer is that virtual services are, I have to think about that more, but it seems like off the cuff, virtual services have HTTP route, which is the better, safer version. It feels like we want a better, safer version of service entry, perhaps eventually. But it seems inconsistent to me to ship virtual services and not ship service entry. In my mind, and this is why I got to talk with Solo and the other folks for why virtual services were needed, but it feels like we should remove them both and be consistent if we don't like them, or have them both.
It's different because virtual service is a waypoint only thing, and service entry is Z-tunnel. And service entry doesn't really make sense for waypoints because we only have ingress waypoints. So how are you never going to hit a google.com on an ingress waypoint, right? It would only really make sense if we do what I assume the next agenda item is, which is about egress waypoints. So to me, they're pretty unrelated. Or they're at least very different.
Yeah, I agree they're very different. I think the overlap is minimal, just in the spirit of the scoping of API, but there's a lot that's different. Okay, I think that's enough for this. I have enough to look at, like, going forward for next week to drive the discussion. Thank you all.
All right. So while Ben is taking notes here, who has this last item, TCP routing for zTunnel? Anyone?
I think that was
Somebody put it
Greg,
up.
I assume. Yeah.
Yep. So I wanted to raise this item since it was part of the Ambient API design doc for egress, specifically how TCP routes could be used in zTunnel for routing egress traffic. And I was wondering if that's still the most valid solution for, I guess, controlling that egress traffic. And yeah, are TCP routes for zTunnel, is that something that's scope for beta or beyond? Here, I will add a link to that particular design doc.
So I'm conflicted. I'm not sure how I feel about TCP route in zTunnel. On the one hand, sure, that would be maybe the spot that we might think about because zTunnel tends to handle L4 things. But also zTunnel, as part of its design, is supposed to be small and kind of cover mesh transport. And from my understanding, at least, like it covers mesh transport and that's it. Adding TCP route definitely feels like an expansion on that. And I think that I personally could be convinced if we had more user feedback indicating that there's a great desire for TCP routing and there's a valid reason why adding a waypoint to do routing is a blocker for people. But in the absence of that, I'm probably leaning on the side of keeping zTunnel small for a beta and letting users change our minds on it.
All right, I know just kind of one of my concerns for, I guess, TCP route, if this is something that if we want to pursue for configuring zTunnel, is the fields that are suggested in the design doc currently don't exist in the TCP route spec. And so I kind of wanted to raise this item because if this is something that we are pursuing, I feel like we should be kind of exploring that design discussion sooner rather than later. Otherwise, like post beta is going to come around and we're going to be delayed on APIs that don't exist right now. So something else to think about too.
I think we discussed this in a very, very, very long thread before on Slack. And I kind of changed a bit my mind, but the fundamental problem is that to support egress, I mean, with L4, since zTunnel only supports L4, we definitely need, if we want to have an egress gateway, we need some way to redirect traffic to the egress gateway. There is no question that otherwise bytes will not go there. Now, TCP route is one way to do it. CNI not messing and letting the CNI layer doing it is another way. But one of the two needs to happen. And so far, we've been very adamant that everything must be captured by zTunnel and we don't want to let the CNI layer take care of it. So that implies that we have to support TCP route. I cannot see how else we can support the use cases of egress gateway or controlling the traffic because there is nothing else. So pick one, I don't know.
Could another possibility be that L4 configuration of virtual service applies to zTunnel? So you can.
Please not. Please don't.
Because right now, virtual service, both L4 and L7 go to Waypoint.
So the problem is we want to use HTTP route instead of virtual service because we just discussed that virtual service has the same problems with. So HTTP route is a place where we separated L4 and L7. So we have TCP route and HTTP route. So if we want to move to HTTP route because it has namespace isolations, then probably we want to move to TCP route as well because it also has namespace isolation and it has proper L4 semantics.
Yeah, I think this generally points to a bigger problem is that with zTunnel, we are operating in the same space as the CNIs. And because we are a general open source project that wants to run everywhere, the natural tendency is to go re-implement every surface that we may need. So we've already reinvented service. We've already reinvented, all these other things. So sure, why not redo some other thing that really is belonging at the CNI layer? And so I think there's kind of a more general direction that we may need to start looking into of, okay, we have this case where we can do everything ourselves for cases where we're in really dumb environments that aren't flexible enough, but we may also need to be able to run zTunnel in a more integrated manner that can make use of the infrastructure instead of replacing it. When we run on Kind, sure, why not replace kubeproxy to do services? It's not very smart. But other CNIs are a lot smarter, and being the 10th project to implement a kubeproxy-like thing is kind of not the best use of time.
And I guess in terms of driving this discussion, since it sounds like definitely needs more design stage at this point, is that doc that I linked to the best place to continue that, or do we need a separate doc specifically for this scenario?
It's probably good to discuss in another doc because that's like the giant ambient APIs doc, right? That was just mostly intended for light future direction. So having a more scope one is probably more clear.
Also, proper support for the gateway and Gamma API is in scope. I mean, if Gamma defines TCP route, and I don't know, I think we support it for sidecars. So one way or another, probably user should expect that TCP route works.
I don't know. There's no CNI that implements it.
But there are other implementation, I think. I remember I saw one with eBPF, so there are other people who support TCP routes, so it should not. And sidecar supports it, no? Didn't you implement it?
Sidecar supports it, yeah. But just because Sidecar supports it doesn't mean we need to support it in zTunnel, right?
Yeah, no, we don't have to support in zTunnel. User should expect a TCP route to work somehow, implemented by CNI or implemented by us or implemented by something. We should not just drop it. I mean, say, hey, we support Gamma, but we don't support TCP route because something. It's fine to allow other implementation to use it. That's my point. I mean, we already have that feature request that I made to let others play if we do want to support it.
Hey, folks, I need to run to another meeting. And if you guys want to continue to discuss, someone else, please take over the presentation. Thank you.
So I guess just kind of summarizing here on this one, it seems like TCP routes should eventually be supported in Ambient. Is that correct, John? Or would you prefer not?
So I think there's two things. One is, do we support egress waypoints? And is TCP route the way we support that? And two is, do we support a general purpose TCP route? Those are two very different questions. I don't see any compelling reason for the latter. And I don't think we should do any of this in the short term. Like we have a big long list of beta tasks, which is completely unreasonable to do in the next 3 months, but we have it scoped for 1.20. Haven't made much progress on any of it. And we spent this, all this time talking about something that's not in that scope. So it'd be much better if we focused on the actual beta tasks, right? Instead of new features.
All right. In general, it sounds like we need a new design doc for this, and there's some skepticism on the priority on this. But so I guess first step will be to get a new design doc together to kind of summarize what we've discussed here and what's currently in that Ambient API doc.
I mean, my feedback is kind of that there shouldn't be a design doc, that we shouldn't spend time on this at all. Obviously, I can't tell you how to spend your time, but I don't want to have us spend the next 3 weeks spending the whole meeting talking about this when we have much more important things that are higher priority to work on.
Right, yeah, I didn't have anything else for this topic then. Were there any other questions?
Hey, I just had a quick question for the community. Is there anybody looking at, I'm thinking of looking at making ambient work with OVS-based CNIs. Is there somebody else working on something similar and would like to collaborate offline on having ambient work with OVS-style CNIs?
I don't know much about OVS, but I am looking into making it work with other CNIs, and there's probably a lot of overlap, so I'd be happy to chat.
Okay.
I have quite a bit of experience with OVS, so I'm happy to collaborate. I probably won't have much cycles to do development, but I'm happy to be involved in the discussions.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, we're already 5 minutes over. Should we call it? Bye, everyone.
Bye.